We're going to talk about square root functions, but before we do that, we're going to do a little bit of review. What is the square root? Well, if I ask you to take the square root of 36, basically what I'm asking you is what number squared will give you 36? And hopefully your answer would be 6. The square root of 144 will be 12. Now this one's a little bit different. It's asking you for the opposite of the square root of 400, where the square root of 400 is 20. The opposite of that is negative 20. And this one's asking you for the square root of negative 196. You need to really think about this. Is there any way possible to take any number and square it and end up with a negative answer? No. So this has no real root. We also are going to need to just go back and review very quickly inequalities. When you're solving an inequality, you solve it just like an equation, do the exact same thing to both sides. And in this case, it says x is greater than or equal to negative 5. That means I can include negative 5 and any number greater than that. In this case, we are going to subtract 10 from both sides. That's going to give me negative 3x is greater than negative 10. Divide both sides by negative 3. I hope you are remembering that when you multiply or divide both sides of an inequality by negative, you flip over the inequality sign and you get x is less than, and this would be a positive 3 1/3. Now in this case, we find out where 3 1/3 is, but you put an open circle there because you're not allowed to include that, and the arrow goes to the left. So now on to our square root functions. A square root function is basically an equation that has a variable underneath the square root sign. Here are some examples of square root functions. You'll notice in this one it's just an x underneath there. Here we've got a 2x plus 1 underneath the radical sign. Here we have an x divided by 2 underneath the radical sign, times 3 in the front and a minus 6 in the back. The secret here is the variable underneath the radical sign. Here are some non-examples. This one, no radical sign, no radical sign. This one does have a radical sign, but you'll notice that it ends right here. The x is not underneath it. So again, to be a square root function, you have to have the variable underneath the radical sign. Here's an example of a square root function. It says y equals 8 radical x gives a speed in feet per second of an object in free fall after falling x number of feet. And then I just want you to use that, okay? So all we're going to do is plug things in. So they want to know, find the speed of the object in free fall after it has fallen 16 feet. We're going to put the 16 in place of the x. Your order of operations tells you to take the square root first, which is 4, and 8 times 4 is 32. So it's 32 feet per second would be the speed. If I put a 35 in there, that's going to be 8 times the square root of 35. Well, there isn't a square root of 35. So in a case like this where they're asking you for a final answer, you're going to need to use your calculator to approximate the square root of 35. So the approximate square root of 35 is 5.9. Multiply that times 8, you get 47.2. Okay, so it's just that easy. All right, let's do it with 9. So 8, square root of 9. Again, there is a square root of 9, it's 3. 8 times 3 is 24 feet per second. And then the last one we're going to do here is 40. 8 times the square root of 40. Again, we're going to approximate the square root of, the approximate square root of 40 is 6.3, and that gives us 50.4 feet per second. So sometimes we're lucky and we get the perfect square. We can take the square root. Sometimes we're not. Okay? Just remember that when you take the square root of a non-negative number, if you take a square root of a negative number, you do not get a real number. So when we have a square root function and we go to pick x values to put in there, we have to make sure that we pick x values that would not give us a negative number underneath the square root sign or underneath the radical sign. All right, and that's really the only part that you have to look at is what's underneath that square root sign. Take a look here and decide what value for x would make this part underneath the radical sign negative. Well, you could say x minus 4 is equal to 0, or it has to be greater than or equal to 0. And that's just like the inequality we solved just a minute ago. So x minus 4 is greater than or equal to 0. So if x minus 4 is greater than or equal to 0, then x has to be greater than or equal to 4. That would be your domain. So when you are choosing x values to go in here, you know you can pick any number from 4 on up. Now let's look at the second one. You set up an inequality and then just solve it and find out that x has to be greater than or equal to negative 3. That's just how easy it is. And again, you don't really care about anything on the outside of the square root sign, just what's underneath the square root sign. Okay, try the last one quickly. Set up your inequality, solve it, and you find out that your domain is going to be x is greater than or equal to 1/2. Okay? All right. Now let's see what this looks like when we graph this. This is what we call the parent function. That would be the simplest square root function that we have, which is just f of x is equal to the square root of x. And this is what it looks like when it's graphed. Again, we just put some values in there for x. You'll notice that we don't use any values less than 0 because that would mean we would be trying to take the square root of a negative, which we cannot do. Now, what I want to do now is I want to look and see what happens when we make some subtle changes to this. All right, these are called your translations. So let's take a look at this. If we start with our parent function and we add something on the outside of the square root sign, look what it does. The blue right here is the parent function. If we add 2, it slides it up 2 places. If we add 4, it slides it up 4 places. If we take away 1, it slides it down. Okay, this is called a vertical translation. We're sliding up and down. And again, that's when you add a value on the outside of the square root sign. If we add something or subtract something on the inside of the square root sign, then we move it. Now, again, the formula here is x minus a. So the move is going to be the opposite of whatever you see here. If you see a plus 4, then it's going to move it 4 to the left. If you see a plus 2, it's going to move it 2 to the left. If you see a minus 1, it moves it 1 to the right. And that is your horizontal translation. So you should have a pretty good idea. You'll notice that these do not have an arrow on the end because they stop here. We have an end to our domain. Our domain cannot be any real number because we cannot have. So take a minute and try to graph these. Again, first set up your domain. What values can x not be? Look what's underneath the radical sign and say, what value would make this negative? Okay, so in this case, your domain has to be 3 or more. So x has to be greater than or equal to 3. Okay, in this one, it would have to be x is greater than or equal to 0. And then just go ahead and make yourself a T-chart or an H-chart, and let's graph those and see what they look like. All right, so let's take a look at these. On the first one, I've graphed the parent one for you in blue, and this is what the one would be here, okay? And then this one should look like this. Again, this is a horizontal translation of 3 to the right. This one had a vertical translation of 4 up, and you'll also see that the 3 out here made it a little bit steeper. And then that's it.